加我就話俾張合約叫我簽，或者李小龍想同我合作一部戲，我咪簽咯，簽咗而家都冇。
In the final years of his life, one of Hong Kong cinema's most enduring legends began to speak about a memory he had long kept private.
You have offended my family, and you have offended the Shaolin Temple.
Shih Kien, known to millions as the ruthless Han from Enter the Dragon, reflected not on rivalry, but on revelation. He spoke of Bruce Lee not as an opponent, but as a young man driven beyond human limits, one whose energy seemed both electric and fragile. Before his death, Shih Kien opened up about Bruce Lee in a way that left everyone speechless, ending decades of silence about what really happened between the two men who defined martial arts cinema. The man Bruce couldn't defeat. When audiences saw Bruce Lee face off against Han in Enter the Dragon, few realized that behind the scenes, Bruce held a profound respect for the man playing his final on-screen adversary. Shih Kien, a veteran actor and lifelong martial artist, wasn't just another co-star. To Bruce, he represented an entirely different generation, a bridge to the traditional world that shaped his father, and, indirectly, himself. There's a story that circulated quietly for years, one that Shih Kien himself would later confirm in interviews. During filming, Bruce and Kien shared a moment of spontaneous sparring. It wasn't staged, nor was it a contest of ego. It began as an exchange of movement, just two masters testing timing and reflex. At one point, Kien evaded Bruce's feint and delivered a controlled palm strike that made light contact with Bruce's face, drawing a hint of blood. The moment passed in seconds, but Bruce's reaction said everything. He smiled, nodded, and called Kien's technique sharp. Years later, when asked about the encounter, Kien downplayed it with characteristic modesty, but his phrasing carried quiet weight. Bruce couldn't defeat experience, he said with a slight laugh. To him, the exchange wasn't about power, it was about perspective. Kien had spent decades performing and perfecting traditional Chinese martial forms on screen long before Enter the Dragon brought Eastern combat to the global stage. He embodied the old guard, measured, disciplined, and patient. Bruce, by contrast, was intensity personified, modern, explosive, and determined to strip away ritual in pursuit of raw efficiency. The two represented different martial philosophies meeting in one defining moment of cinema. Their sparring was never recorded, but its symbolism endured. For Kien, it wasn't about landing a strike. It was about demonstrating that age and calm still held a kind of invincibility that youth and speed could never replicate. In that sense, Bruce didn't lose the exchange, he learned from it. And Kien, who would live to nearly 100 years old, seemed to embody the very longevity Bruce had sensed was slipping away. As Kien later reflected, what Bruce could never defeat wasn't another fighter, but time itself. And behind the lens of Enter the Dragon, that truth was already quietly revealing itself. A clash of generations. The production of Enter the Dragon in 1973 marked a pivotal moment not only in Bruce Lee's career, but in the evolution of martial arts cinema. For Shih Kien, who had already acted in over 100 films, it was something different, a collaboration between East and West, led by a man whose presence seemed to alter the air around him. Kien later recalled that Bruce was unlike anyone he had ever worked with, intense, efficient, and unwilling to treat the film industry as mere performance. To Bruce, every scene was an extension of his philosophy, an opportunity to express truth through motion. Kien often described Bruce's work habits in striking detail. Each morning, before most of the cast arrived, Bruce would be seen stretching beside his car outside the studio gates. He would limber his shoulders, practice kicks in the open air, and then go directly into training sequences before the day's shooting even began. Unlike other actors who saved their energy for the camera, Bruce seemed to have no separation between preparation and performance. He was constantly refining, constantly testing his limits. But what stood out most to Kien was how Bruce's intensity came with a visible cost. By late afternoon, Kien noticed the sharpness in Bruce's eyes start to fade. His movements were still precise, but the energy behind them dimmed. Makeup artists would apply fresh powder to cover the exhaustion under his eyes, and Bruce would quietly lean back in the chair, breathing deeply before being called to set again. Kien, already in his late 50s, watched with concern. He had endured countless long shoots before, yet even he could sense something unusual in Bruce's rhythm, an urgency that bordered on self-punishment. In interviews years later, Kien reflected on those moments with a mix of admiration and unease. He worked as if the hours would run out, Kien said. Even when he should rest, he was stretching, moving, planning. To Kien, Bruce wasn't simply an actor in his prime. He was a man racing against an invisible clock. The generational gap between them was clear, but never divisive. Kien embodied the wisdom of restraint. Bruce embodied the power of momentum. Yet, on set, the two found an unspoken balance. Between takes, they would occasionally share tea, exchange techniques, or speak briefly about philosophy. To onlookers, it was a meeting of two worlds, one rooted in endurance, the other burning with immediacy. Shih Kien didn't try to slow Bruce down. Few could have. But in his later recollections, the tone of his words carried something heavier than nostalgia. He had watched a young man strive for perfection, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit that perfection might be consuming him from within. The uncle and nephew bond. Despite their fierce on-screen rivalry, Bruce Lee and Shih Kien shared a relationship built on mutual respect and quiet familiarity. Long before cameras rolled on Enter the Dragon, Kien had already known Bruce's father, Lee Hoi Chuen, from Hong Kong's bustling film scene. The elder Lee had been a well-known Cantonese opera performer, while Kien was already establishing himself as a dependable martial arts villain. That connection carried forward decades later when Bruce entered the industry, now as a world-famous icon returning to Hong Kong to redefine martial arts cinema. On set, Bruce didn't address Kien as a co-star. He called him Uncle Kien. The title wasn't for show. It reflected a genuine cultural respect embedded in Chinese tradition. For his part, Kien called Bruce nephew, often offering the kind of gentle advice that an elder might give to a younger man too eager to push his limits. Their exchanges were brief but meaningful. Between fight scenes and rehearsals, they spoke about discipline, endurance, and the difference between living for the art and letting the art consume you. Kien would later describe Bruce as unbelievably hardworking, a man who demanded more of himself than anyone around him could imagine. Yet, he also noticed something deeply human behind Bruce's relentless focus, a quiet exhaustion masked by energy. He worked through fatigue, Kien recalled, but you could see it in his eyes. For all his fame, Bruce was still the son of a performer Kien had once known as a boy running through Hong Kong studios. That memory made it difficult for Kien to separate the legend from the person. Their familial bond softened what could have been a tense professional dynamic. While many actors found Bruce's perfectionism intimidating, Kien understood it as part of his character. He didn't take offense when Bruce corrected movements or insisted on retakes. Instead, he admired the young man's precision. He wanted truth in motion, Kien once said, not just acting. That same mutual regard translated into their fight choreography. Though scripted, their battle at the end of Enter the Dragon carried a symbolic weight far beyond the film. It was youth versus experience, velocity against patience. Bruce moved with the aggression of modern martial philosophy. Kien countered with the calm of an older generation. It was a dance between two philosophies of combat, one ascending, one enduring. Years later, when Kien looked back on their time together, his words carried more than nostalgia. He hinted at moments when Bruce confided in him about fatigue and purpose, conversations Kien kept private for decades. What he would eventually reveal near the end of his life began in those quiet exchanges, when uncle and nephew spoke not as rivals, but as family. Subtle warnings. Signs Bruce ignored. As filming continued, Shih Kien began noticing signs that unsettled him. The long days on set didn't just tire Bruce Lee, they seemed to drain him in a way Kien hadn't seen before. The younger man's movements remained crisp and explosive, But there were fleeting moments when the light in his eyes dulled and his breathing slowed. Between takes, Bruce would drop into stretches beside a wall or quietly rehearse a sequence alone, as if he couldn't allow his body a single moment of stillness. Kien, who had seen decades of martial arts performers push themselves for film, understood the risks of constant exertion. He had lived through injuries, exhaustion, and the grind of endless studio schedules. Yet what he saw in Bruce went beyond the normal demands of production. It was as if Bruce feared what would happen if he ever stopped moving. He lived as though rest would betray him, Kien later observed. There were subtle moments when Kien tried to intervene, though never directly. He would make quiet remarks during lunch breaks or while waiting for lighting adjustments. "The body remembers every hour you don't let it rest," he once told Bruce, more as an elder's observation than a warning. Bruce only smiled, brushing it aside. To him, physical fatigue was a form of progress, a sign that he had gone far enough to reach his edge. By late afternoon each day, Bruce's exhaustion became increasingly noticeable. He would retreat to the makeup room between setups, shoulders heavy, sweat soaking through his costume. Kien often passed him there, Bruce silent, head lowered, deep in thought. There was no complaint, no sign of weakness, just a quiet intensity that unsettled the older man. Something about it felt different, as though Bruce knew his pace was unsustainable but refused to slow down. Kien didn't press further. He respected Bruce's privacy and focus, but the image of that silent fatigue stayed with him long after the production ended. It was only years later that he began to understand what those long, unspoken silences in the makeup room might have meant. The discipline that consumed him. To Shih Kien, Bruce Lee's energy seemed inexhaustible until the day it almost wasn't. During the filming and post-production of Enter the Dragon, Kien began to notice subtle but troubling changes in Bruce's health. What once appeared as unstoppable vitality was now shadowed by fatigue. The younger man's body, honed to perfection through years of punishing discipline, was beginning to show signs of strain that even Bruce refused to acknowledge. Those close to the production recalled how Bruce trained obsessively, rehearsing movements between takes, performing his own stunts, and pushing for perfection in every frame. But by that stage in his career, Bruce was no longer operating on reserves of energy. He was borrowing against them. Kien, with decades of experience behind him, understood that kind of overexertion could not continue forever. He had seen actors collapse under far less pressure. Yet Bruce kept moving, as if still trying to prove that no human limitation could hold him back. Then came the moment that confirmed Kien's fears. During the dubbing sessions for Enter the Dragon, Bruce collapsed. The studio had been stiflingly hot, the air conditioning turned off to avoid background noise, and Bruce, already dehydrated, fainted mid-session. When he began convulsing, panic swept the room. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors diagnosed cerebral edema, swelling of the brain caused by heat stroke. It was a close call that nearly cost him his life. In the aftermath, doctors were astonished at his condition. Physically, Bruce seemed as fit as an 18-year-old, yet his body had reached a breaking point. Kien later learned of a detail that explained the incident. Bruce had undergone surgery to remove his underarm sweat glands, a decision meant to enhance his on-screen appearance, but one that severely compromised his ability to regulate body temperature. Combined with his relentless training and stress, it was a dangerous mix. When Bruce returned to the set after recovering, Kien noticed a change, not in his movement, but in his eyes. There was a quietness behind them, a flicker of awareness that something had shifted. Kien didn't press him, but he offered a simple warning: rest when you can. Bruce only smiled, brushing it aside with characteristic confidence. Yet in that exchange, Kien sensed that Bruce knew more than he let on, that perhaps he had already begun to feel the cost of his own perfectionism. The makeup room prophecy. For decades, Shih Kien rarely spoke about the most haunting exchange he ever shared with Bruce Lee. It wasn't on a film set or during a choreographed scene. It was in the quiet of the makeup room, away from cameras and noise, where the mask of performance briefly fell away. Before his death, Kien finally opened up about that conversation. His recollection would leave audiences speechless. He remembered Bruce sitting beside him one afternoon, their reflections caught in the mirror. The crew was preparing for another take, and Bruce looked unusually still. He wasn't stretching, rehearsing, or studying movements, just silent. Then, almost out of nowhere, he spoke. "Uncle Kien," Bruce said softly, "I won't have such a long life as you." The words startled him. For a man known for confidence, power, and vitality, Bruce's tone was calm, even certain. Kien turned to him, unsure how to respond. He laughed lightly at first, thinking it was a casual remark. But Bruce's expression didn't change. There was no self-pity in his eyes, only quiet conviction. Kien urged him to rest more, to slow down now that films, not daily martial training, had become his primary work. Bruce simply smiled, shaking his head. "Movies are just a side business," he replied. "Training, that's what I'm really here for." That remark unsettled Kien. He realized Bruce wasn't joking. The younger man seemed to sense something unspoken about his own health, a forewarning he didn't want to admit but couldn't ignore. Kien said that for a long moment after, the room fell silent except for the hum of studio lights. When Bruce was called to set, he stood, bowed slightly, and walked out. Kien stayed seated, uneasy, staring at the empty chair beside him. Years later, when Kien retold the story during one of his final interviews, his voice carried the same disbelief he'd felt that day. It was clear that Kien sensed that the man he referred to as nephew fully understood that his time was running out. It was this revelation, spoken only after decades of silence, that stunned those who heard it. Fans had always imagined Bruce Lee as invincible, a man who transcended limits. But through Kien's words, a different image emerged. A man fully aware of the cost of his pace, yet unwilling to live any other way. For Shih Kien, that brief moment in the mirror became impossible to forget, a prophecy that only made sense once it was too late. What Bruce saw in Shih Kien. In his later interviews, Shih Kien didn't just speak about Bruce Lee, he also reflected on what Bruce had seen in him. Beneath their generational and stylistic differences, there was a deep mutual recognition. Bruce was a visionary, obsessed with innovation and speed. Kien was the embodiment of endurance, balance, and control. Together, they represented two ends of the martial arts spectrum, one blazing forward, the other rooted in time-tested tradition. Bruce respected Kien not merely for his acting experience, but for his lifelong dedication to authentic martial arts. Kien had trained for decades in classical Chinese combat and performed in films long before Bruce's global fame. During breaks in filming, Bruce often asked Kien to demonstrate traditional spear and hand techniques. Even as the world's most famous martial artist, Bruce never stopped learning. He was always curious, Kien said. He wanted to see how everything fit together. That curiosity revealed something deeper about Bruce's mindset. He viewed martial arts as a continuous evolution, not a hierarchy of old versus new. In Kien's presence, Bruce found a mirror, someone who embodied what he was striving for but could never quite attain: equilibrium. Kien's movements were steady, unhurried, grounded in patience. Bruce's were explosive, urgent, and relentless. To Kien, this contrast defined their connection. "He had the speed of youth," Kien later said, "but I had the patience of years." We learned from each other without saying much. When Kien eventually spoke about the prophecy in the makeup room, he did so with reverence, not drama. What he wanted people to understand was the depth of Bruce's self-awareness and the quiet respect that existed between them. Bruce had seen something in Kien that reminded him of balance, perhaps even of what his own body could not maintain. In a sense, their final conversation was not a prediction, but an acknowledgement. Bruce knew his energy burned brighter than most, and Kien represented the opposite, a steady flame that never went out. The older man's calm seemed to fascinate him, as if he were looking at an alternate path he knew he wouldn't take. After Bruce's death, Kien never spoke of that day until he himself neared the end of his life. Legacy of Two Warriors. Kien's decision to recount these moments, particularly the prophecy in the makeup room, was not born of a desire for sensationalism. It was an effort to honor the complexity of Bruce's character. He remembered the way Bruce trained through exhaustion, yet never lost sight of the artistry in each movement, the way he pushed his body to limits that Kien, with all his experience, knew were dangerous. In sharing these memories, Kien revealed that true strength is not only physical, it is measured by patience, foresight, and the ability to recognize one's limits. Bruce's brilliance was awe-inspiring, but Kien's calm resilience endured, and therein lies a duality that has resonated with generations of martial artists and film enthusiasts alike. Beyond their films and their fights, Bruce and Kien left philosophical legacies. Bruce's legacy lies in the electrifying immediacy of his energy, the radical redefinition of martial arts cinema, and the belief that physical limits can be tested and transcended. Kien's legacy, quieter but no less profound, offers a counterbalance. That discipline without destruction, composure without pride, and respect without compromise are forms of victory all their own. By opening up near the end of his life, Kien allowed audiences to see the man behind the martial arts icon. He reminded the world that Bruce, for all his superhuman feats, carried a human awareness of his own fragility, a truth that resonates now, decades after their work on screen. In that reflection, the story of two warriors continues to echo, teaching that the greatest lessons often lie not in the fight itself, but in the understanding, respect, and quiet endurance that outlasts the spectacle. Do you think Bruce Lee's greatest challenge was ever another fighter, or the pace that even he couldn't defeat? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.